It all started late last night when the plane hit some turbulence. Before the thunk, my biggest worry had been the overcrowded airplane. I had imagined the experience to be like using a funnel to fit sardines into a can. But, as it turned out, my first flight had been surprisingly, I don't want to say empty because it wasn't, but it wasn't jam-packed like I expected. There was a nervous-looking guy sitting alone across the aisle, one row up, and quite a few other empty seats here and there. I had mentally prepared myself for overcrowding, missed connections, cancellations, and delays. But, ironically, none of those were the reason I finished the last leg of my trip on an 8-hour bus ride, rather than in the connecting flight I would have had plenty of time to make. No, I opted for land travel because of what happened as a result of the turbulence. The man sitting alone, I don't know his name, so let's call him Bob, was dabbing sweat from his face from the moment the engines roared to life. He was the first to hit the call flight attendant button, and did so to order himself a stiff drink. I don't think there was anything malicious about him, he just seemed like a nervous flyer to me. Had kind of a dad vibe to him, you know? The only reason I paid him any mind was that he kind of looked like a colleague of mine. From there, he just kind of became a target of my people watching, while I waited to be able to use my large electronics. We hadn't been in the air for very long when the captain announced that we were about to hit the turbulence. As a frequent flyer, I wasn't all that worried, even when he told the flight attendants to strap in. Look, I get that turbulence is scary, but it's not like it comes out of the blue. There's a reason pilots can warn you ahead of time. Plenty of other flights have flown through that same space safely. If the skies were too dangerous, the flights would be canceled or rerouted. Bob didn't understand this. Bob was white-knuckling the armrest. Me, I was listening to music and trying to pass the time. But then, amidst the turbulent shaking, I felt a distinct thunk directly above me. A thunk I could have sworn pushed the plane down a few feet. It was unusual because it didn't feel like an air pocket. The impact reverberated throughout the ceiling. It felt tangible, real, like a bird hitting a freshly cleaned window. Birds don't tend to hit the tops of planes, though. The windshield or engines, probably. But the top? Unless it fell from the sky or mistook the plane for a giant worm, I can't imagine how that would be possible. But since no one else seemed to notice it or comment on it, I let it go. The flying eventually got smoother and everyone began to doze off. Even nervous Bob. I tried to sleep. Lord knows I needed it. I had worked all day and took 3 buses to get to the airport. Unfortunately, I'm a light sleeper and the woman next to me had elbows like daggers and kept hogging the armrest. Every time I felt my head dip, she'd jab me in her sleep, and I'd snap awake. In an attempt to escape her lethal elbows, I pushed myself against the wall and looked out of the window at the starry night sky. Far from the lights of the city and high above the clouds, I could see so many more stars than usual. But every once in a while, clusters of them would disappear. I'd blink and they'd be right back to where they were. I didn't think much of it, and I eventually closed my eyes and fell asleep. I don't know how long my nap lasted. I didn't check the time, but I know I wasn't fully rested when I woke up due to a light tapping on the window. I saw something in my peripheral vision. Something that looked like fingers stretching over the outside of the window and blocking the stars from view. But I was bleary-eyed and exhausted. By the time I had rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, all I could see were stars and a few strings of cloud concealing them. I didn't try to go back to sleep. The only thing worse than not sleeping is getting intermittent bouts of sleep. Besides, my neck was getting stiff and I needed to move back into range of stabby McElbows before everything cramped up. I sat straight and stared at the ceiling, hoping we'd arrive at our destination soon and that I wouldn't miss my connecting flight. From time to time, I'd check the window, but everything seemed normal. Then, I'm not sure how I heard them over the sound of the engine, but I began to hear those little tapping sounds all around me. One minute they were at the front of the cabin, a few minutes later behind me, sometimes on the right side, sometimes on the left. They didn't seem loud, but they must have been. Otherwise, they couldn't have pierced the drone of the engines. I figured maybe it was hail, though we weren't flying through any clouds. Aside from the tapping, it was peaceful as a plane could be. Everyone was still fast asleep. No babies were crying. No angsty children were screaming about the Wi-Fi, and the flight attendants were nowhere to be seen. I relaxed until I noticed a window far ahead on the other side of the cabin. It was black. Pitch black. Not, I turned off the lights and the room is dark black, but actual darkness. A darkness so complete, I almost thought if I walked over there and touched the window, my arm would go straight through it. There were no clouds outside the window. No stars. No flicker of the lights coming from the wings. Just a wall of endless darkness. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I couldn't process it. I felt a twinge of fear and I wasn't even sure why. And then, I watched as fingers began to poke through. These long, gnarled fingers made of the same darkness gripped the sides of the window. It seemed solid and liquid all at once. Like silly putty. It's hard to describe. It had a shape that held together, but it was fluid in its own constraints, like a plastic glove filled with water. You can change the shape of the glove, squeezing and twisting, and though it can look a million different ways, there's always the same amount of liquid inside. That's what this thing looked like. As the fingers turned to hands, the hands to arms, and the arms to a head and shoulders, I found myself frozen in my seat. Its liquidy arms stretched out far in front of it, reaching for the aisle. And then, somebody coughed. The figure whipped back through the window. The night sky outside returned. I was covered in a cold sweat, and the only thing to shake my fear away was to tell myself that I was dreaming, even if it was the most realistic dream I had ever had. Now I was on the edge, looking from window to window, expecting the blackness to return. It was quiet at first, and remained quiet for a good 10 minutes, until the tapping resumed. Tapping ahead, tapping behind, tapping to my right and to my left. And finally, as though satisfied by its assessment, the blackness coated another window, this one closer to me and in an empty row. I remember whispering, "Hey," but I couldn't tell you whether I was trying to wake myself or everyone else up. Whichever it wasn't enough to break me out of the paralyzing grip of terror. Watching the creature slowly climb out of the window felt unreal to me. Thinking about it now still does. It's like I wasn't even in my own body anymore. I felt like I was watching the scene from a third-person point of view. I could feel the frustration of somebody watching a horror movie, screaming "run" at their screen, but I couldn't do anything about it. The shadow took its time, quietly slithering itself out of the small window. It was bigger than a person, so big you wouldn't think it could fit through a window. But, like a cat adjusting to the size of a box, it found a way in. It looked somewhat humanoid in shape, but it definitely wasn't human. No face, no features, just a giant, malleable sheet of darkness. It was so large it had to hunch over even as it reached the aisle. I couldn't tell you which way it was looking, or if it could even see at all. Its unsettling black fingers reached for the top of the seats, touching them like feelers as it advanced. It had an awkward gait that felt wholly alien, but also somehow graceful. I know I'm contradicting myself, but it's hard to put into words. It was unnatural to me, but seemed perfectly natural to it. It was like seeing one of those deep sea creatures you can't quite understand. But you don't have to understand it for it to exist and move and live the way it does. That's its design. And while the design is completely unlike the design of anything else on Earth, it still works. It has its own sets of rules, its own gravity. It makes sense, it's just unreal. It slithered and sloshed along the aisle, coming closer and closer to me with every motion. Even though I had no way of knowing its intention, and even though it had no face, I felt like it was staring right at me, like I was its target, and it was feeling around trying to find me while I was powerless to escape. I felt my heart beating harder and harder, and I tried to scream myself awake, but all I could do was sit there and tremble in my boots. What the hell is... It was Bob. He didn't have time to finish his sentence, because the creature turned its large frame towards him, and lunged at him like some sort of octopus, wrapping itself around him tightly and snuffing out the sound. I couldn't even hear a scream. There was a crunch, and that sound seemed to wake the other passengers. Before they could even look, the creature dove through the window, leaving an empty seat where Bob had once sat. No one seemed to notice Bob's absence. No one except for me. He had been traveling alone. The seat could have been empty the whole time. I tried to reassure myself it had all been a dream, that Bob had never been there at all. But as we landed and I got up to leave the plane, I saw his handkerchief lying abandoned on his seat.